Mirror, mirror. Another method of direct communication with our inner selves take place is what we term telepathy. They send us mind pictures or words that flash information on the bulletin board of our innards. At times, we don't consciously recognize the news flash as anything other than a stray thought from nowhere. We don't see or sense the tie-in to the great communication highway between the inner and outer world. As I went about my daily chores one day, a thought came to mind which I had never previously entertained. I wondered what it would be like to be blind and if the blind could see or sense color. Not 5 minutes later, my actress daughter called in great excitement. She just landed the lead in a play about a blind girl with heightened sensitivity to her environment. While studying an upcoming projects list another time, my eye settled on one in particular. It was a radio show on which I wanted to be interviewed, and it was on my list because I needed to mail them a copy of my first book, Beyond the Winning Streak. I remembered that Stan had some information for me regarding the show, so I placed a call to his beeper. Within seconds, my phone rang. It was Stan. I said, "That was a fast response." He didn't know what I was talking about. He said he'd had a thought about the radio show that he wanted to pass on to me, so he'd called. Just when he finished this sentence, his beeper rang with my message. One of my most startling episodes of telepathy I experienced happened long before my introduction to metaphysics. Newly divorced, I moved my 2 small children into an apartment complex. My 6-year-old son asked if he could take his 1-year-old sister by the hand and walk her around our building. Since I was in the midst of unpacking, it sounded like a great idea, so I sent them on their way with an admonition to be careful and stay close. About 5 minutes later, I was in the bathroom unloading makeup into a drawer when I happened to glance into the mirror. My mind blanked and I saw the gate to the pool wide open and Matt grabbing Kathleen's hand and jerking her away from the water's edge. No other people were in the scene. I ran out of the apartment and frantically searched for the pool. I had not previously perused the grounds, so I had no conscious idea of where it was located, but I quickly found myself standing at the open pool gate. The kids were nowhere to be found in the vacant swimming area. I headed back toward our apartment, still in panic and shouting their names, and finally heard Matt's return call. He hurried towards me, obviously upset, dragging his sister by the hand. It seems he had taken Kathleen for a walk at the pool's edge and she'd slipped. Just in the nick of time, Matt had tightened his grip on her little hand and pulled her back to safety. Setting the stage for whispers. Hearing our inner guidance isn't usually that dramatic. More likely, it's a quiet assistance that we don't even know we've received. We react in a certain way and don't question why. Not that we need to, as long as we go where we want to go. It's when we block or intellectualize the information coming through our inner senses that problems arise. That's when we rethink an impulse and don't call our aged aunt, only to learn later she was slipping into depression and our voice would have soothed it. It's when we ignore the unease about marrying a certain person and end up in a divorce court years later. What I found extremely helpful in my early days of metaphysics, when I didn't have the slightest notion of how to interact consciously with my inner self, was to meditate. I don't do it as much now, but it was very important to me back then. What it did was allow me to silence my mind and start building a belief that I could consciously hear my guidance. Not that I did particularly, but I started believing it was possible. Later, after my confidence increased and I started sensing or hearing things in real time, I got away from lengthy meditations. I still use an altered state, or what Seth calls psychological time or psi time, frequently to visualize future events and work with beliefs, but I seldom meditate with the express purpose of gaining insights. That's not to say I found the answer. I have for me but not necessarily for you, and mine probably will change over time. As individualized consciousness in physical form, there can't possibly be one designated path that, when uncovered, leads all explorers into ultimate fulfillment. We're so creative and so different in makeup from our fellow travelers that we'll approach our psychic growth from any number of angles, trying this and that and shedding it when it no longer applies. In my more naive days, when I thought my answer was everyone's answer, I asked the committee whether there was a need to go into a meditative state once we grew beyond it, thinking they'd say no and pat me on the head for having uncovered a universal truth. Instead, they said, for some of you, yes, because individually you may have set things up that way. You create the needs, the rituals, and the processes in order to accomplish what you will in your personal hallucination of physical reality. Individual flexibility is the name of the game in this fascinating world of fiction made fact. So where's all the spirituality in this down-to-earth, practical, clear interaction with our inner selves? I guess it depends on your definition of spirituality, which, of course, is a reflection of your beliefs. If you want your inner self to be just this side of God, no problem. It will play the part beautifully, using these and thous as freely as necessary to make you feel comfortable. If you want to pay homage to your inner self, assign it to the role of deity in metaphysical clothing or visitor from another planet, that's fine too. After all, it's your reality. You have a right, as consciousness and physicality, learning to deal with idea constructions, to act on your beliefs of choice. Just a friendly suggestion. Take it or leave it. Try not to set your inner self too far apart from your natural being. Don't see it as a pattern of perfection you must strive toward, but which is ultimately beyond your grasp, or as a being light years ahead of you in spiritual growth. It's a long way back to reality when the trip starts so far from home. And as a race, we've seen too many centuries of such detachment and its consequences to want to experience more. Enough must someday be enough. Chapter 3. In your present moment of time, you are positioned in the center of a cosmic web of probabilities that is affected by your slightest mental or emotional act. Seth, The Unknown Reality, Volume 1, Session 686. On a moment's notice. Understanding simultaneous time becomes an important factor in deciphering clues to conscious creation. It's a fascinating subject and one loaded with insight as to how the physical world is formed on a moment-by-moment basis. When we understand what we're dealing with, the flexibility of this reality becomes so apparent that we wonder why we didn't catch on to it more quickly. Oversoul 7 and the Museum of Time is a delightful novel by Jane Roberts about Oversoul 7, a non-physical oversoul who has reached a certain level of education and expertise with the unknowing help of several of his souls, in physical reality, whom he instructs and assists. At one point, Cyprus, 7's own oversoul and mentor, calls him to a meeting in Framework 2. For educational purposes, 7 chooses not to remember that he has visited Framework 2 many times, and so is enchanted by the scene Cyprus has created for him. An outdoor earth setting of great beauty. 7 says, "But everything looks brand new, as if it were all created in this instant. I mean, that one rose, it's a bud, so of course it looks new. But beside it is a much bigger rose with all of its petals open, and it looks brand new too." With an enigmatic smile, Cyprus replies, "Precisely." From the words of this novel comes literal truth. According to Seth, every moment of experience is a new one, replete with newly formed physical objects that have entered this reality through the immediate moment point of time. Our moments are constantly refreshed from Framework 2, where everything is created anew before entering our lives. The implication of that information boggles the mind. Nothing is in physical reality long enough to age. Not our bodies, not material objects, not nature. It's all created on a moment by moment basis under the watchful eyes and adept hands of our inner selves. Seth says, no particular object exists long enough as an indivisible, rigid, or identical thing to change with age. The energy behind it weakens, the physical pattern therefore blurs. After a certain point, each recreation becomes less perfect from our standpoint. After many such recreations that have been unperceived by you, then you notice a difference and assume that a change has occurred. Matter of itself, however, is no more continuous, no more given to growth or age than is, say, the color yellow. Another mind-stretching implication of the simultaneous time/framework 2 idea is that everything we see and experience in physical reality is after the fact. It's old news. Our thoughts, attitudes, and beliefs suggest which event will be chosen from the infinite field of probabilities. Then, in the dream or out-of-body state, we try them on for size, and if they're acceptable to us, i.e., reflect the symbols of our beliefs and expectations precisely, in they come to physical reality. So what we experience in the present was started by previous thoughts and finished in Framework 2 prior to its appearance in our lives. What we think in the present starts the selection of the next event. How surprised we are when we happen to meet an old friend unexpectedly. How enraged we are when passed over for promotion. How powerless we feel when we believe another's energy has impacted us negatively. How excited we are after a blind date that worked. And how astonished we feel when we win the lottery. How frightened we are at an act of violence. How desolate we feel when our house burns down. How joyous we are at the birth of our baby. The question on the table: do you remember why any event can happen in the first place? Because we're consciousness here to learn that our thoughts have created power, and our journey into physicality is specifically chosen so we can see our idea constructions in living color and determine their effects. We're here to play with energy and see what happens. That we experience events of horror or joy is neutral in the greater scheme of things. They are simply scenes reflective of our inner psychological makeup. Obviously, they are not neutral when met in our lives, because in physicality we're dealing with feelings and emotions meant to warn us when our idea constructions are off kilter, or not to the good of ourselves or others. And that's why we're studying simultaneous time in the first place, to learn its flexibility and the ease it offers of changing what we don't like in our lives. Selecting new probabilities. Probabilities reside outside time and space, as do the controllers of those probabilities, our inner selves. In other words, the activity generated by our thoughts is handed outside physical reality, where time and space have no validity and therefore don't impact the selection of probabilities. From our knowledge of simultaneous time and consciousness emerges an understanding as to how probabilities function. The ebb and flow of life is the result of the unpredictable nature of consciousness units. They can be what they want to be, when they want to be it. Never are they predestined by God or the universe to become a part of an event or object. What directs them into certain mold is thoughts held in the present moment. That thought then nudges CUs toward probabilities that best reflect the meaning behind the thought. This applies to personal, individual events and mass events shared by many others. In no way can we predict what will happen to us for sure, because we can choose to accept as our reality any number of given, unpredictable events at any time, right up to the last minute, so to speak. So, can world or personal events be forecasted by seers and psychics? Absolutely. They are consciousness with clairvoyant and telepathic abilities, just like the rest of us. Their skills may be honed more sharply than ours, that's all. But what they pick up is only the most probable outcome based on the thoughts that are forming it at the moment. By changing thoughts, the event loses its intensity and becomes less of a probability. The new thoughts then activate other probabilities that start their movement toward actualization. Whether it's the thought of an individual or a large group of people, it works the same way. What this tells us very clearly is reflected in one of Seth's most incredible statements. The point of power is in the present. He maintains that all events, past, present, and future, are selected in the present moment based on our thoughts. Knowing this, he says, clears our eyes to the fact that we have inexhaustible energy and ability at our command, and it releases us from the psychological need to test ourselves against the barriers of the past. The point of power is in the present, and from that moment you choose which you and which world. Now, doesn't this tell us something important? Something life-changing? It tells us that there is no past. There is no past. We build the past in the present based on the probabilities to which we give the most intensity through our thoughts. It means the hurts, the sadness, the supposed failures no longer can derail our lives unless we continue to reinforce them by our belief in them. We can set them on the back shelf of our memories, turn our present around with a change of attitude and beliefs, and get on with getting on. This fact, more than any other, gives us back our freedom. Our past can no longer impact us unless we allow it to. We, dear friends, are truly free spirits with great power at our fingertips. The power to not only create our lives one time, but over and over and over again, based on new probability selections. Each moment of our life is drenched in possibility because each moment is drenched in probabilities. The selection of new probabilities doesn't happen just once a month, it happens constantly throughout the day. Each choice we make has within it the ability to get us where we want to go, even if the decision seems wrong at the time. How can it not? When every probability we can ever encounter surrounds us right now. The great flexibility of our reality constantly allows for forward movement. We're never boxed into a corner with nowhere to go, even when it seems we've hit the proverbial wall. Creation's moment point. Will I ever get it? I wondered for the 1000th time with a twinge of desperation coloring the thought. Will I ever have complete faith in my ability to allow the universe to support me? I mean, not just sometime, but all the time, no matter what. I fell asleep with those words running through my mind and awoke to pack for my trip to Virginia. I was on my way to spend the 4th of July with my children. Matt and Kathleen were temporarily sharing housing in Fairfax, while Kathleen was finishing her degree at George Mason University, just blocks from their home. One of the last items to go into my suitcase was a new mystery I'd purchased the previous week. That night in bed, I pulled the book out and, as the universe would have it, kicked off a whole summer of questions around the subject of simultaneous time. The mystery was a humorous one about a group of nuns who found themselves in the midst of drug dealers and worse. One of the nuns, the heroine of the story, was almost revered by her cohorts because she had what they called perfect faith. They defined it as the unequivocal assumption that everything would always work out just fine, that there was no situation that wouldn't sort itself out to the holder's benefit because God would protect her or him. And that's exactly what happened to our heroine time after time as she raced between murderers and mafia. She was not only sheltered from harm, she led the way to some very dramatic successes. I was quite taken by the idea of perfect faith and what it represented. Setting aside the belief that it was an outside source protecting her, I still felt the nun was onto something. Yes, that's what I wanted. Perfect faith. I mulled it over, thought about what the nun had faced and conquered, and even though it was fiction, I knew it didn't have to be. I knew perfect faith is what we all can feel, and that the outcome would be the same for us as for the book's heroine. When I returned home, Stan and I talked to the committee about perfect faith. They said that in case I hadn't yet caught on, I should know it led the list of subjects I had chosen to learn this time around. While that statement in itself was thought-provoking, it took a backseat to the bombshell answer to my next question, which was, and don't ask me why I asked it or even how it entered my head to ask, when was the material and perfect faith placed in that book? Their answer, the night I needed assistance.